Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I am the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. We are a nonprofit public benefit organization based here in Marin County that produces research and advisory on Marin's economy. You can find out more about our work and sign up for events like these and view our research and other products by visiting our website at www.marineconomicforum.org. So welcome to the April edition of the Marin Economic Briefing. These briefings are something that we devised last year as a monthly series, basically to inform the Marin community on how our economy is performing. And especially we developed this in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, because there are certain indicators that economists like our organization and policymakers look at when we're trying to really evaluate the health of an economy. And sometimes this data is difficult to interpret and it comes at all kinds of different times of the month. And so we thought that by having a series like this, we'd be able to help the community really keep their finger on the pulse of the economy and how we're doing, especially as it looks to recovery. In March, instead of hosting a Marin Economic Briefing, we held our annual Forecasting the Future event, which was a more robust and deeper dive into the Marin and the state of California economy. And we had presentations from local elected officials, and we also had a special presentation from the CEO of the Bay Area Council, Jim Wunderman, looking at this idea of the California Exodus, which is something many of you have probably been reading about. So that program was recorded, and you can also see a recording of that on our website. I encourage you to do that. Again, great presentations there. So this morning I'm joined as always by the MEF Chief Economist, Dr. Rob Eiler, who's going to take us through some of the data. And at the end of the program, I'll be giving a little bit of a summary of sort of where the Marin economy is looking both pre and post COVID-19. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is closed captioning, and we are recording this. The recording will be sent around. Usually we get it to you by the end of the day, maybe tomorrow. We'll include a link to the recording that we hope that you share with your colleagues. This is a free event that we put on, again, on a monthly basis, and we really want to have a lot of people tuning into this. So with that, we will be keeping this 30 minutes quick today. And so let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, who's going to take us through the data. Rob, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to share my screen now. Mike, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So folks, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take us through some of the national data, talk about the state of California, and then do a little bit of a deep dive on some of the major metrics that we're watching at Marin Economic Forum with respect to the Marin County economy. This is the labor force watch, meaning that we're kind of watching the evolution of the unemployed and hopefully seeing more of a tick down in these numbers. The temporarily unemployed are shown here from January 2007 to March 2021, which are the latest data. And you can see the spike in early 2020 specific to those that became temporarily unemployed. And that faded relatively quickly as we moved through the summer toward the fall. But the permanently unemployed picked up. And now what you can see is you can easily see the Great Recession on this graph, the big blue hill about a quarter of the way from moving left to right. And you can also see that the evolution of the permanently unemployed now in the what we're going to call the COVID-19 recession has become about equivalent or actually a little bit more than the temporarily unemployed as we've gotten to March 2021. So one of the things economists were concerned about is that we would see the permanently unemployed become more expansive in terms of the total unemployed labor force. And we really want that blue region to shape downward as soon as possible. We will see if the new fiscal stimulus, if the spring and summer travel season, which hopefully will be more robust, will start to really chew up a lot of the unemployed and turn them into job holders. The other ways you become unemployed is to temporarily or complete a temporary job and then be looking for some other type of work. You may leave your job. You may re-enter the labor force after being out of it. And so we've seen a lot of parents who maybe had to stay home with their kids or even have to stay home because of childcare issues otherwise coming back into the labor force, and we will see if that number goes down relatively quickly. But you can see historically that number is relatively large with respect to people kind of coming in and out of the labor force. And these are new entrants, generally speaking, high school and college graduates that are now coming in for the first time. So that rainbow color to the amount of people unemployed in the United States, the larger that gets vis-a-vis the temporarily unemployed, the longer potential duration of the labor market recession as a result of COVID-19. To see it at the industrial level through March 2021, these are the US data. And you can see that in April 2020, looking back 1 year, so these data should be read as the percentage change in jobs in the industry shown here with respect to 1 year previous to the month at hand. So in this case, this is April 2020, looking back 1 year. You can see that food services and drinking places, bars and restaurants, accommodation, hotels and motels saw very strong declines when the COVID-19 recession began. But by December 2020, there had been some recovery momentum. Then January gave a little bit of that recovery back. February got a little bit more recovery momentum, and March was pretty good. So one of the things about the March data, if you read the headlines, is that for the US, we saw March as a comeback month and potentially the beginning of the true final stages of recovery to get back to just where we were at the beginning of 2020 with respect to jobs. All these columns are still negative. They all need to move above that red dotted line at some point. And we'll be comparing in the next month and beyond to the 2019 data, because the 2020 is so low vis-a-vis the 2019 data that we really are thinking about just getting back to the 2019 level. And then, for example, by December 2021, getting back hopefully closer to where we started 2020 pre-COVID-19. But there looks like there is momentum in the US economy. The fiscal stimulus should generate even more momentum over the next few months, as well as getting the vaccines proliferated and hopefully turning the corner on the number of cases. Another way that we're watching the evolution of recovery in terms of the labor market is to compare it to the Great Recession's recovery momentum. So I took the Great Recession, started it in November 2007, because that's where we really started to see job losses month on month really begin in the United States, and make it the same number as January 2020, in the sense creating an index number of both, starting them on the same date. This is what the Great Recession looked like in the US. It took about 78 months, seasonally adjusted, to get back to where we started the Great Recession. That's a really long period of time for an economy to have job losses from a specific date. In the COVID-19 case, the US economy looks like this. You can see the sharp decline. And by May 2020, we basically had seen the bottom of the job losses. And then we've had decent recovery momentum until the beginning of winter, where we flattened out a little bit, but March you can see picked up. That 94.7 number suggests that we're 94.7% back to the volume of workers in the United States that we started 2020 with. And that's really just going to get us back to what you think of as a recovered economy, not a growing one. We need that black line to move toward the red dotted line as fast as possible. To look briefly at California, and then we're going to see some other comparisons with California later when we look at Marin County, but for California and the major metropolitan statistical areas, these are the data through February. So the US data are updated through March. The California data and the state and county level data are just through February. But there's some things here to think about. One is you see California in the first two columns. We got 8.4% unemployment, and we still are about 6.7% down from where we were in February 2020, right before COVID-19 really started to seize up the economy based on social policy choices. And would suggest that we had at least some decent momentum from the bottom, but we still got a lot of people out of work. If you look across the state, the Los Angeles metropolitan statistical area, generally speaking, the LA basin, is still about 11% unemployment, still hurting from the reduction of jobs in the travel side and also in the entertainment industry and the, let's say, the concentric circles around those industries in terms of how they affect other parts of the Los Angeles economy. 8.1% down, but 10.9% unemployment. So that contrast then plays out in the labor force changes. And as you move to the San Francisco MSA, where San Diego and Sacramento are doing relatively well in sort of in a similar path, the San Francisco MSA has a couple of weird anomalies in it. Notice the labor force change at -7.4, suggesting that there's some changes there in the composition of the labor force, whether people have retired, have left the San Francisco area, have decided, at least for the time being, to walk away from their job because of childcare issues or some other reasons, and are going to come back in the labor force. This is some concerns because you see a 5.5% unemployment rate, but if most of the change in the labor force is because people who are unemployed have left the labor force, notice there's still 10.6% of the people who had a job last February don't have a job this February. It's something to watch that dynamic. We'll come back and talk about this a little bit more deeply when we talk about Marin County in a second. But generally speaking, these numbers show two stories. One, we have recovered with the idea that we are up from the bottom, and we saw that earlier at the US level. We're going to see more at the Marin County level. But we have some weird anomalies about intrastate movements and specific areas of the state that are recovering at a faster pace than others. Look at the same data in terms of comparisons to the Great Recession. Here's the Great Recession in California. It took about 70 months. The EDD has just revamped its data again. So I used to talk about it being about 63 months. Now it's about 70 months in the new data. Regardless, it's got basically the same bowl shape as the US, just a little bit faster recovery. And this is COVID-19 in California. More choppy because in California, our social policies have followed the science a little bit more closely in terms of stopping and starting the economy reopening. And you can see that choppiness versus the more smooth movement of the US we saw in the previous graph. 93.1%, again, that means we're 93.1% back to the volume of workers in California we started with in January 2020. We need that black line to get back up to the red dotted line. Now, one of the things that Mike alluded to is that we've been following on a monthly basis the evolution of the COVID-19 recession with respect to Marin County specifically, and some deep dive data, which we're going to talk about now. We call this the Marin Recovery Data Tool. And it's more expansive, and we have a broader set of data that we have available. But I'm going to show you some of the highlights, specifically in the labor market, but also thinking about things like building permits in a second. These are the data for Marin County as contrasted to the data for California that we just saw. So notice the labor force in Marin County is down about 5%, while the unemployment rate is at 5%, suggesting that there's some dynamics happening within Marin County in terms of people potentially leaving the labor force, potentially retiring, or leaving the area versus California on average. And California on average has kind of a weird dynamic happening in terms of people leaving the state, but also people coming into the state, and how they're trading off labor force is something that we'll have to deal with after a couple of years. We don't have those data in real time because we just don't know the composition of new households and new people that are coming into California or those that are leaving. But you can see Marin County is doing very similar to what it's done in the past, relatively fast recovery versus the state on average. But there's still about 7.6% of residents in Marin County who are out of work that had a job 1 year ago. Showing the same data we looked at for the US and for California in terms of the recovery with respect to the Great Recession. Here is Marin County, same idea, starting in November 2007. Marin County entered the Great Recession a little bit after the US and California did, and got out of it more quickly in terms of residential employment. You can see though, the same sort of bowl shape. It took a while to get there, just about 58 months. And here's COVID-19. So what is different about this recession for sure is that almost every single major county in California, including those that are like Marin County that are tied to a major metropolitan area, same sort of choppiness in terms of jobs recovery, following the social policies, opening, contracting, not the smooth movement of the US, 96.2% or 92.6% back to the red line. So while the local economy has recovered, there is still a capacity issue in terms of what the number of people working who are residents of Marin County were previous to COVID-19 and where we are as of February 2021 in the data. We're expecting this line to move relatively quickly up to the red line over the next 12 months vis-a-vis the rest of the state, but we'll see how Marin County goes. Again, part of this is the labor force dynamic we saw in the previous graph. Breaking it down at an industrial level, same deal. Here's April 2020, where the big cuts happened. Then we saw recovery momentum, and we actually saw in the middle, you can see transportation, warehousing, utilities was actually positive growth year on year as of December 2020. A lot of that because we moved our consumption lives online, and thus we needed more logistics, warehousing, et cetera. We saw positive movement there. Every other major industry category was down. Here's January, February, and these are the latest data. So I'm going to stop here for a second and talk about some of these dynamics. You can see on the far right-hand side, leisure and hospitality down about 28% as of February 2021. So that's bars, restaurants, and hotels. base primarily, some event centers, attractions, and that kind of thing, but 28%, 28 out of 100 people who had a job February 2020, not working February 2021. And unfortunately, we just don't know the dynamics of those folks that are out of work. Did they find work in some other industry? Maybe. Did they leave the area? Maybe. Have they walked away from the labor force or retired? Maybe. It's very tricky to know the dynamics of that. So from a workforce development standpoint, there's a lot of challenges when you see these numbers. How do you attack these numbers in a way that actually benefits the local area if you just don't know the current labor or housing situation, meaning that do they live locally anymore or not? Do they work locally anymore or not? Something to watch. These numbers are historically large, though, in terms of year-on-year job loss. Other services, hair salons, nail salons, nonprofits not related to healthcare, 26% down. And in fact, if you notice, the dynamic between those two industries is a little different. Leisure and hospitality has slowly walked up the ladder toward that red dotted line. We need it to go above that red dotted line at some point. Other services started that direction and have faded the last couple of months. A lot of that because of social restrictions and not quite fully reopening, though we know Marin County has reopened a little bit faster than other counties. We're likely to see those two categories walk up more quickly toward the red dotted line over the next 4 or 5 months. Otherwise, pretty decent momentum. If you think about what we saw in previous graphs, Marin County is recovering at a little faster speed in some areas. For example, in professional and business services, that would actually see positive movement as of February 2021, which means growth. We will see how the next few months go. Another place to think about is building permits. So we generally use, as economists, we use building permits as a way of forecasting construction demand and ultimately the evolution of construction jobs, because construction and manufacturing are two industries that really pull a lot of other industries behind it when they grow. In Marin County, we've seen some wild dynamics since the Great Recession. You can see on the first third of this graph moving left to right, a lot of home building, all sort of tied up in the housing markets and mortgage markets of the first decade of the new millennium, then a steep fall in the number of new permits for housing, then pretty decent momentum into 2013, some flatness, then a downturn 2017 and 2019, basically flat as a pancake at relatively low numbers, and then up the ladder in 2019 and 20 as new projects come in. Small economies like Marin County can see a lot of quick movements in these when you have a couple of projects suddenly come online through permitting processes, but then the downturn since then. Well, the downturn is actually not anomalous to Marin County. Most counties in California saw a downturn in building permits, but the one thing that this suggests is that we have to watch going forward how many new houses become permitted in California, or I'm sorry, in Marin County versus other parts of the state, and what that means on the supply side for housing, but also what it means for the jobs demand in construction, where the slow movement of housing permits means that you're moving construction demand more toward remodeling and things that are not necessarily new housing. So we will see. We should not expect an enormous amount of commercial real estate building either, which is, and you can see the last couple of years there in terms of sort of showcasing those dynamics. But on the commercial real estate side, we shouldn't expect much construction. There's a lot of uncertainty boiled in right now to the commercial real estate market. As we start to recover, will we see people come back to the office or not? This is office space specifically. Industrial and warehouse space has very strong demand right now. We may see more construction move toward industrial and warehousing. In Marin County, we don't have an enormous amount of land where there's just going to be these huge plots of warehousing suddenly appearing. But on the office side, the forecast is really the key. Downturn in inventory, downturn in vacancy rate is being forecasted, and it's probably because a lot of kicking of tires is happening with respect to where we might see office demand show up with respect to not necessarily in the urban areas, but people working from home. There may be some hybrid dynamics where people are working from home Monday, Wednesday, Friday, maybe going to a local office on Tuesday and Thursday rather than commuting all the way in to the urban areas. We will see. That's something that's behind these forecasts. We can see the asking rent is falling a little bit. So while vacancy rates go down, rents might be also going down with the idea you're trying to generate demand, but we should not expect much construction in commercial real estate. The two big areas of commercial real estate to watch are going to be multifamily and office generally, but also retail and downtown. So I should have said three. Those are the three major areas to watch, because if we get through and get more recovery momentum, the sort of specter of mass vacancy in rentals on the rental side of the housing market may start to fade, but office and retail are probably still going to have some really nasty dynamics inside of them for the next 12 to 18 months, simply because there's so much uncertainty about either people coming back to the office or not, and potentially working from home, especially in the greater Bay Area And the second is the evolution of retail, given that we have moved some of our lives online and more, which might spell some relatively nasty futures for our local, sometimes locally owned retailers. I'm going to hand it back over to Mike now.
Rob, thanks so much. Again, there's really important data in here, and I noticed that we don't have as good a turnout this morning, but for those of you that are working with public officials, there's two really important and somewhat concerning issues that Rob addressed through the data there. The first one is Marin County is recovering its jobs at a slower rate than the US and the state of California. And that is, as Rob said, mostly due to the labor force dynamics, and very specifically that we have a lot of the sort of lower skilled, lower wage jobs here in Marin County. And those have been highly subject to the social policy, the closure. So things like bars, restaurants, nail salons, like we keep mentioning, not to pick on those industries at all. They're just the ones that have been more adversely affected by the shutdowns in terms of not being able to retain their workforce. And so a lot of those jobs have not been replaced. We do expect that to come back. These are in what Rob and I call snapback sectors, which are sectors that, once they're open, demand is going to be really high to go, get your haircut again, as we're seeing. Restaurants are already having a little bit of a hard time hiring. I'll talk a little bit about that. The second really interesting piece and somewhat concerning is on the building permits. And so whether you're an advocate of housing or not here in Marin County, which has been such a challenging issue for us over the years and remains to be, if you look at the graph that Rob showed, you'll see a real, in some cases, a decline, but basically a stagnation of permits for construction housing units being approved. And that's concerning because that is very much an upstream measurement, meaning that that's based on permits, not actual construction happening. So when you look around Marin right now and you see multi-unit, multi-family housing going up, that's stuff that's been, permit was approved probably back where that, in that, 2018, 2019 timeframe. The fact that we've had so few permits approved now means in the next couple of years, at least in Marin County, construction is going to probably taper off a little bit. And again, we're not talking about remodeling homes here. Demand for that type of work, it has remained extremely high. But this idea of major construction projects, which pump so much money into the local economy, we don't see those coming online for the next couple of years. And I think that's concerning. So as taking this broad look at the county in terms of economic indicators right now, those two things jump out to me as problematic. And so for those of you on the line, spread the word to your colleagues and friends that this is a pain point for Marin right now in the COVID-19 recovery. So speaking of recovery, what I wanted to do with the few minutes that we have left here was to take everybody back to 2019 when MEF was conducting the Marin County Business Retention and Expansion Project, which was the first ever of its kind. And the goal of this project was to identify the major challenges for businesses to growing, because the majority of economic growth in a region occurs from existing businesses. And so we wanted to understand what the businesses in Marin County were saying about their challenges to growth. And just in March, actually, 2020, we had published a report of our findings. And so it was seemed an appropriate opportunity to look back now a year ago to see what we were saying as the major challenges in Marin and sort of compare and contrast that to what we're now seeing as some of the challenges with COVID-19. And so although there are some new challenges that have emerged as a result of COVID-19, we wanted to just sort of look at what's the pre and post situation with those challenges that we had identified in our project. And so the first one, if you can all recall, not that long ago, that people were complaining about how difficult it was to hire a worker, especially at the lower skill level. So the stores in the malls were scrambling to find retail personnel. Restaurants, it was a constant struggle to find. They had a lot of high turnover and a lot of difficulty finding new workers. But this was not just limited to the lower skilled job. We heard from professional services firms like engineering firms, architecture firms, that it was also difficult to hire at that level. Now, at the time, many people attributed this to the lack of housing and workforce housing specifically. That is a factor. We acknowledge that. But there's also really a misalignment of the labor force that is here in Marin and the jobs that are here in Marin. Meaning that we have a lot of low-skilled jobs here. We don't have a big workforce of people at the lower-skilled, low-wage level. So those companies, although they were hardest hit, as I mentioned, and they had to shed a lot of workers, now that they're reopening and there's this pent-up demand from the consumers, it's once again a situation where it's difficult to hire at this lower-skilled jobs. And what we don't know and what we're keeping a careful eye on is what is the proliferation of remote work going to do for our high-skilled residents? Does that mean that the jobs and companies here that need higher skilled workers, is it going to be more difficult for them to hire because maybe local residents are taking remote work jobs with companies that are based outside of the Bay Area, maybe even based out of the state of California, because remote work is becoming more the norm and more possible? Or are we going to see companies here benefit from the remote work thing, meaning that they themselves can hire from somebody who's not in Marin County itself? That's something that remains to be seen. But we do know that at the lower skilled occupation levels, we're already seeing signs that labor force dynamic is coming back. Transportation, the issue pre-COVID was, how do we get workers and even customers to some of these destinations that require what we call the last mile connectivity? So for example, in Tiburon, it's not that easy to take public transportation to get out there. So for those businesses that want to host visitors and other consumers, what kind of options do they have to get people out there with public transportation? Not many, right? Well, now the issue is less about how are you going to get people to these tricky destinations. The issue is more about how are you going to get people on public transportation? And if you're a public transportation planner, you need to allocate these different resources in terms of where demand is going to be highest, which means you might have to cut off some more traditional routes. So the transportation issue is going to remain. On sales and competition, I mean, it'd be too simple just to say that, online commerce, e-commerce was a threat before, and it's even more so now. It goes deeper than that because a lot of services that people rely on have made what we call a digital shift, meaning that you don't have to go to the bank anymore. You can scan checks and deposit them. There's all kinds of different service-oriented businesses that have adapted to online, which means the competition for customers is going to be even more difficult. And then finally, with commercial real estate, Rob touched on this. Before we knew it was a problem, particularly among those firms that are seeking Class A, the sort of coveted, nicer, higher end office space. There's just not a lot of inventory in Marin County, and there's not a lot of building, as Rob suggested, and land to build on. So that's always been a problem. That is one sector that, unlike the rest of the Bay Area, San Francisco and Oakland specifically, San Jose, that saw companies just sort of get rid of their offices or sublease the space. That's not the case in Marin. Availability is down, prices are up. So that's going to continue to remain. But the other thing is, if you watch the news, you'll see that both Northgate and the Fireman's Fund properties, which are two of the biggest properties in Marin County, are now considering mixed use, which is going to include housing and even less office space. So that's good on the one side for increasing the housing stock, not as good for increasing the office stock, which is what we're going to need to do to make sure good jobs come here. So that's, it's really interesting to take a look at. The report that we published. It is available on our website. I encourage all of you to take a look at that because it's very rich in data. And those problems, as I've just laid out, still remain. And it's something we're going to have to look at. But we are up against time. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning in. We will be doing this again next month with a new set of fresh data. Again, please do spread the word. This is a free event that we put a lot of time in preparing. We've made it closed captioning to increase access, and it is recorded, so we will be sending a recording to you. And again, thank you for tuning in to MEF's programs and your support. I'm going to end it now so everybody can get on with their day. But stay safe out there and keep your eyes on our economy. Thanks, everybody.